The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I just wanted to let you know, if you were wondering what David was saying there, he was just correcting Elspeth's bio read. He was like, I've won that twice, actually. Congratulations, pal. But also, yeah, I'll give you a minute. But also, congratulations on this book, on the many books, and you knew that I was going to bring this up today.
What?
The sheer number of books that you keep writing.
Oh.
You're making the rest of us look a little bit bad.
There's a lot of time on my hands.
And this is actually a roast, so get ready.
I don't know. I'll take it.
I'll tell you this. I want to begin with Diane Ratuski, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
Diane Ratuski was David's grade 3 teacher, and you wrote a bunch of books, but specifically you wrote Jack Loves Tarts, and
Deep cut.
wrote it at 9 years old, and the author page of that book read, David Robertson is 9, and he loves writing books. He lives in Manitoba. He wrote 4 books this year. His favorite hobbies are art and gymnastics.
Where'd you get that from?
First of all, it's literally in your memoir.
Oh, is it?
And
Okay.
second of all, more importantly, nothing of that has changed. You still wrote 4 books this year.
That's true. I do 4 years since I'm 8.
So tell me about this prolific pace, because like that's an extraordinary amount of output from the age of 9 till now, writing 4 books a year. How do you do it, pal?
Actually, the secret is I don't really write that much. You know.
What do you mean?
You just like take manageable chunks every day. You can't write a book in a day. A book is, like 80, 70, 80, 90,000 words. But you can write 1,000 words in a day. You do that every day for 3-4 months, then you have a book. So then, you do that 4 times during a day, then you have 4 books at the end of 4 months. It's easy.
Aren't you guys also mad at him now? Like it's like you just easy. You just show up to the thing and you just start writing, and it's totally fine. No, I'm upset about everything that you just said there. But also,
yep.
is gymnastics still a through line in your life?
Gymnastics?
Yeah.
No.
You're a medalist in pommel horse, David.
You've really dug in. Yeah. I think I got 4th place, actually. In 3rd place or 4th place, you would know. In the pommel horse.
It's 4th place.
4th
You're
place,
not a medalist.
So
Yeah, it was a ribbon.
Got a participation trophy.
I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm insulted that you think I would not read every single thing you've written in preparation for this moment.
I love it.
But also, I think it's worth noting that from the time that you spent on fiction, your nonfiction books work, I think, in a different way than other nonfiction books do. I think other nonfiction books, I'm used to them sort of starting from the inside and building out. And I think what you've done with 3 nonfiction books is start kind of from the outside in, which is to say, conversations you were already having. It feels like kind of being pulled into a place. I read this book. I read your book about anxiety, but also your book about your dad. There's some kind of through line of you're pulling together things that you were already kind of talking about. What's that process like?
I think, in a lot of ways, all these books are a product of years of work. Blackwater, I talked about my dad since I started, in 2010. And I talked about him almost every speech I ever gave. And in that conversation, in the ongoing conversation, he just became this huge piece of fabric in everything that I did. And it just felt like at a point, I'd told the story so often and to so many people, I just felt like it was time. I felt a pull to put that down onto paper. And so I built that book from really years of work and building that story. I mean, I was writing that story in a lot of ways for a decade. And the same for All Little Monsters. If anything, that book I've been writing since I was a kid. It was the first time I dealt with anxiety, to talking about it publicly, to being more of an advocate for it, and deciding again, it was time for me to put that down into a book and share it, because I've been sharing it to audiences here and there for a long time. I wanted a bigger platform for it. And I think the same is true of this book as well. You know, reconciliation has been a topic of mine since I started writing. It was probably the main focus for me in all the books I've done, whether it's a picture book or whether it's an adult book, whether it's a comic book, picture book, novel, it's all reconciliation. And so in that work, and in the work I've done with schools, talking with teachers, talking with kids, there was a lot of questions about like, yeah, we want to do it, but like, how do we do it? And I don't want to make a mistake. And so there's a little bit of anxiety there too about like, well, I mean, we don't want to do things wrong. We want to do things the proper way. How do we go about doing that? So I decided to make this guide, you know, because of that. And the main thing I think to say about that is like, it's part of the process to make mistakes, you know. And so, but to have some sort of a helping hand, I think, because we all are in a community, we support each other. And so this is a book I think that is a support for people to find a way to start out.
Yeah, when I think about, I'll come back to that in just a moment. When I think about reading All the Little Monsters, and then I read Blackwater afterwards, and what I was struck by is like Blackwater came out 2020,
2020.
One of the through lines there is that like the entirety of Blackwater, you're openly talking about your anxiety. It's kind of woven into that book. And then you get to All the Little Monsters, and there's something about that book that's saying, you know what, I've talked about this before, but let me put it into one place, all of these learnings. In terms of this book, again, you've had these conversations before. This has been literally a part of your career. You've worked in Indigenous education, but also, hang on, I'm trying to remember the phrase, but I did not write it down, because, God, no. What was your previous job?
Well, I worked as a publishing and communications manager for Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center. Yeah. Did that for about 10 years. And before that, I worked in Indigenous employment and workforce development.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Which is to say, like, this has been kind of like a practice work for you. And then you kind of, because I think when I was reading this book, what I read in it is an anticipation of, hey, you're going to find this part challenging. I know that you will, but here's how to get started. How many of those conversations have you had just kind of throughout your career?
I don't even know how many. Like, I mean, it's almost daily, right? I mean, it's talking to people in an event, which I'm lucky to do almost every day. You know, I do whether it's at a school or a festival or whatever it might be. So a lot of conversations, and those conversations kind of it really educated me too. Not only in how I viewed reconciliation, but how I viewed the path to reconciliation. And so that was a huge help for me, not only the work that I do daily, but in writing this book as well. It guided me, you know, in writing a guide.
I think the thing that I'm reacting to most is the ways that you sort of start off by setting the book by saying, I understand that we are now using the word reconciliation much more commonly. That is not a word that has existed in sort of the public discourse for that long. About 2008 is when you kind of pin it to.
Yeah.
And as it sort of like enter the public discourse, and you've now sort of seen the evidence of like you can't go to a school and see Canadian history taught the same way, for example. But also, there's the flip side, which is to say a word becomes rote, becomes too familiar. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of concerns in using the word reconciliation, at least for me and what I've seen. One of them is that, you know, it becomes like a buzzword. And when something becomes so rote, there's a worry that I have about complacency and fatigue, really. And so that was something I wanted to get over. And part of the way that we do that is expand our view of what it means. Because sometimes I think when we talk about reconciliation, we think it's to do with one thing. And rightly so. I mean, residential school history is an enormous part of reconciliation. Learning the history, knowing its impacts, understanding intergenerational trauma, you know, and resiliency, and all of the things connected to it. Very important. But there's a wider breadth. So it's also understanding that reconciliation includes a knowledge of colonial history in Canada, which involves multiple systems of failure in this country. So that's a big part of it. But the term itself is problematic, like for me at least. And I use it, but I think if we use it, as long as we understand it better, I think that's where we want to get to. Because reconciliation really is a misnomer. What we're talking about when we use the term reconciliation is a return to a relationship. We're trying to fix something that broke, that ostensibly was okay at one point. I don't think in Canada we've ever had a right relationship, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canada. I don't think there ever was. So, we talk about like what is real reconciliation, and I used an example of my parents, I think, in the book, where it's like, my parents were separated for about 12 years, 11 years. They had a really good relationship. They met in Melita. My dad was a minister there. Saw this beautiful woman in the congregation. Thank goodness, because then I came out of that. My brothers too, but and then their marriage broke down, and my dad was involved in Indigenous education, worked super hard, was away all the time. It led to a breakdown of their relationship, and they were separated for about 10 years, 11 years, but during that time they worked, and here's the important thing too, they worked on themselves first, then they worked on each other, and when they got to the point where they were able to work on each other and fix that relationship, then they got back together. And that is reconciliation. And so what we're trying to do in this country, I don't think we can really call it that in its term as we understand it, as I understand it.
Because you're not returning to some
We're not returning to anything. Yeah. I think what we want to do is we want to build something. And that takes everybody, but we want to build a community, a strong community, because I don't think we've ever had one yet, but I think we're getting there. And I have the privilege of going to schools, probably 100, 150 schools a year, and I see that. I see that we're building it, and it's hopeful, but there's a long way to go. And if we get tired of it, we're not going to get there. So, to stay on the course, to stay motivated, and to get a clear vision of where we need to go and how we're going to get there.
So this book is sort of like pre-anticipating me, like before you get tired, these are very specific things you can do here.
Some easy. Yeah. And I think it's about the steps we can take. And that's why some of these are like, listen to an album. Just listen to William Prince. I mean, that's a pretty good step. Like to listen to an album of his. He's great. Watch Reservation Dogs. It's entertaining. It's an incredibly well executed show. You can learn a lot too. And then, once we're there, let's read the calls to action. Understand those a little better. So they're all like steps that are manageable, that kind of build into more complicated, difficult things, but they're all doable. And I give in this book breathers of like things like just listen to a podcast, things like that, and then let's read something.
So I'm gonna come back to the specific 52 ways in just a moment, but I want to maybe frame the book to me, this book is in conversation with Tanya Talaga's book, right? So Tanya just put out The Knowing a few months ago, and to me, the way that they're in conversation with each other is that there is a track that is about sort of an intellectual social history of the country, and Tanya's thesis of that book is it's what she calls the knowing, is being like, what does it mean to sort of carry in all of us the knowledge that the country was built on dispossession, that the country was built on genocide, that the country had all of these elements in its history. Because it's one thing to sort of read about it. It's another to say, okay, I got to reconfigure my relationship to all these institutions. And then where your book comes in is trying to say, you want to take that knowing and then figure out how to make it practical. So these are sort of like real life ways where this can sort of apply. You interact with these institutions differently. You make different choices based on this. Do you sort of see, first of all, do you see those two as in conversation with each other at all?
Yeah, and I think it was actually apropos that I was able to host her launch in Winnipeg for the Knowing, and we've connected a lot since then. I think we have similar goals and similar visions. So yeah, I think that there is a conversation between those two, but I think they go quite well together.
But then, as you sort of try to translate that knowledge, I think there is something about trying to identify the places where those actions can kind of become more accessible. And the one I want to talk about first is maybe actually not one of the easy ones, which is to say, It's the one about teaching, learning hard history with your kids. Do you want to talk about that one? Because I think that was one of the more complex ones.
It is complex because I feel like it's hard to have those conversations with youth. It's necessary, but it's difficult. And I think like for that, some of the lived experience I have in having those conversations is actually writing When We Were Alone. When We Were Alone was my first picture book, and when I wrote that book, it was after I read the calls to action. And in the calls to action, that was 2015, I believe, one of them was that we need to start teaching this history to kindergartners. When I saw that, I thought, first of all, that's putting a lot of weight on teachers. And teachers are, those are the most important people we have, in my opinion. And so what support are we giving them? Are we instituting any kind of teacher training program that will support them in knowing how to do that in the classroom in an effective way for kindergartners? And if we are doing that, then what supports do we have in terms of resources to provide to them to help them out with that job, a very difficult job? And I just didn't see anything out there for kindergartners in terms of literature. Because as a writer, I always obviously think of books. I'm like, what's out there for books? There are a lot out there for kind of mid-years elementary school. The Fatty Legs, I'm Not a Number, those books like that. There's nothing for young kids. So I wrote When We Were Alone because of that. When We Were Alone is a way that we can talk to young kids, kindergartners, about residential schools. And it's not that we shouldn't be talking to kids about these things. We actually should. There's a great quote by Maurice Senec that I'll never be able to remember exactly, but it's saying, like, if it's true, tell them. You don't keep them from the truth. It's how you tell them. That's kind of what my job is as a writer. And so it's age appropriateness and empathy. So the conversations that we have with kids isn't about things like genocide, isn't about things like, abuse and the really hard things about that history. But we can talk about the principles of the residential school system and the elimination of identity. Kids get that. I mean, first of all, kids are incredibly smart. If we talk about cutting of hair, if we talk about loss of language, we talk about, the removal from family. We talk about having to wear a uniform and not being able to wear the clothes that we love to wear, and how that relates to identity and how that would make them feel if they weren't able to have those things. Then that starts the path. And we should be teaching it that young, but how we teach it young builds a foundation that we can build on throughout a kid's schooling experience, all the way through high school. And so that's kind of how I approach anything that I do, is building that foundation. And so When We Were Alone, I think, is a good example of how you can approach teaching that to young kids. It's vocabulary, it's age appropriateness, it's how we introduce it. And I think always having empathy first at hand in our mind when we have those conversations.
What I like is that you really move between the private actions and the public actions. And to me, what really struck me is an invitation to attend a demonstration. I don't think that's a small thing. I think the idea of saying, you know what, one thing you can do is pick a specific place where people are gathering and join that gathering for the purpose, specifically a protest. How do you see protest as a part of reconciliation?
Well, it's community. That's what it is. It's gathering. It's community. And I've been to a lot of them. And what strikes me every time I go to them, when the Unmarked Graves happened, or when Tina Fontaine's accused murder was acquitted, when her body was discovered, we gathered together in community. And it wasn't just Indigenous people at these gatherings. It was everybody, And there was a lot of respect in those gatherings. There was a lot of listening, active listening, and there's a lot of people teaching. But more than anything, it was a coming together. And I think that's such an important way that we heal collectively, and that we also mobilize and find ways that we can create change. And so I think it's important to do that. So, inevitably, unfortunately, in this country, something's going to happen that we're going to need to demonstrate or come together protest for. And being an active participant and knowing when to be an active participant and when to listen, I think is a really important step to take. So in the book, I think it's it's going to happen at some point, usually in the calendar year. And so when it happens, you should go. Even just go to listen and learn, and then teach yourself something or allow yourself to be taught something that you can bring forward into your own life and use effectively.
When you were sort of sitting down to figure out the 52 ways, I gotta say that, one, I imagine you coming up with 95. There's no way that you
probably
could
almost 90-something, yeah.
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 I would have imagined you having a hard time being like, okay, we got it down to a calendar year. How do we do that?
Yeah.
So I imagine there's going to be a sequel at some point. But also,
I don't know about that.
It's not. Why not?
Well, it was
52 more ways.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. It's a great idea.
Just saying. Yeah.
And then the omnibus would be like 104 ways. But but no, I think like one of the steps in this book is to write your own action, right? And so I feel like what I want to happen from this book is for people to take this and really do it every week. You can use it really any order you want. There's only a few that are tied to specific dates. But after you've done it, I think it gives you enough where you can figure out some actions of your own. And that's the hope. I mean, I've tried never to be prescriptive when we talk about reconciliation. It doesn't mean much if I'm telling everybody what to do all the time. Then you're just being told what to do. This is a little bit of a push and a little bit of a guide. But the end result for me is hopefully that people will be motivated to do their own actions, to take their own actions and know how to do that. So there's not going to be a sequel, I don't think.
Well, first of all, you pre-anticipated me.
You are the sequel. That's the thing.
Is it okay?
They are the sequel,
Tell them
right?
that.
Yeah.
You pre-anticipated me a little bit by talking about the call to say, like, create your own action.
Because we're just like...
Yeah, we're just, it's a whole thing. Yeah. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But
okay.
The reason I was bringing up setting down 52 is because you toggle between levels of ask, levels of difficulty, of saying, I understand this will be difficult for you. Mm-hmm. And it's easy enough, for someone to stream a William Prince album. They can do that. You can do that. Don't do it now. We're having a conversation.
Do it on the way home.
But I do think the protest one is an interesting one because it also asks you to gauge your own level of engagement and investment, right? Which is to say, like, is it as straightforward for someone to say, you know what, I am going to join a protest in support of the Wet'suwet'en who are blocking the pipeline from being built? Or is it as straightforward to join a protest and say, yeah, you have to search the landfill in Manitoba? I think those are two different levels of asking someone to say, you got to pick a position on this. How did you sort of like toggle the levels of difficulty in the ask? Would you say?
I don't know. I think you just first of all, I think it's asking people to check in with themselves and to see, when they're ready to do stuff and how ready they are, and what kind of involvement are they ready to take is one thing. But I think it's part of the process of learning and knowing that this is a path that we take that we need to continually learn for and make mistakes and grow and ready ourselves to take more complex and effective action with bigger asks. And so I don't think that one action is more important than another, but I do want in this book for people to ready themselves in a good way, so they don't feel overwhelmed by what we're asking in this book, but they feel that they've been kind of prepared in a good way, and so that they're ready to take on the things that are in here that I'm asking them to do, or just suggesting that they do.
What I was really struck by is how much time you also spent going backwards and saying, look, this would have been a difficult ask 10 years ago. It would have been a difficult thing to suggest to a person, hey, go watch a movie by an Indigenous filmmaker. It's not going to be, because now you can find that, and it's a little bit more findable than it was, 10 years ago. As you were putting together this book, was there, tell me about like reflecting on the ways that the idea of reconciliation has become public property, but also useful public property in the last 10 years or so.
Well, I think it's just I invoke my dad a lot when I talk, and so one of the things I talked about my dad a lot was reconciliation. We talked about not only what it was, and we had similar ideas of it, what it entailed. Honestly, like at its simplest form, reconciliation is a conversation, and that's what we need to do. We need to talk to each other, and learn from each other, and come to like a mutual understanding and respect for each other. I mean, imagine that if we had that, if we actually just talked and listened and learned. and then, based on actual knowledge, took action. What that does, though, is requires us to look backwards, And so my dad used to always say that you don't know where you are unless you know where you've been. You have to understand where you've been. Now, that is at a personal level in our own lives, and that could be like something like Blackwater for me, or All Little Monsters. Like that book looks at the same, it approaches the narrative in the same way. You look back. For me, I learned a lot about myself in writing those books by looking back on my life. Now, everybody would benefit from doing that. As a Canadian, looking back on our history in this country is important. And this book will never say, and I will never say, that this is anybody's fault. There's no room for guilt in this movement. For me, there's no room for guilt. But if you are Canadian, you have an accountability to the history. And that history is something you should know about. You should understand what has brought us to where we are today. So residential school history. But also things like the social assistance program in 1945, and how that really disproportionately affected Indigenous families and communities. And one of the things about the social assistance program in 1945 was it required families to have a fixed address and for their kids to go to school in order to access monetary support. For Indigenous people living on the trap lines, that required them to leave their way of life behind and to send their kids to school. That's a colonial system, right? And so all of this requires us to learn about that history. When we know the history, we have a better understanding of where we are today as Canadians, and then we can form a vision of where we want to be as Canadians. Like what we are who we are now as Canadians. What kind of Canadians do we want to be? And I think that requires us to do a lot of reflection, a lot of looking at where we are, and then a lot of envisioning of where we can get to together as a community. So that's what that spectrum looks like for me.
You said something interesting that I want to pick up on, which is the idea that there's no room for guilt. First of all, there's some room for guilt. But
depends on who you are.
Fair enough. But I do think that there is room for the reverse, right? There's maybe a danger of the reverse, which is to say that, look, you are one of the most visible Indigenous authors in this country. I imagine there are some... Okay.
Well,
I will leave the stage, man. Okay. You wrote 4 books this year. I don't know what you're talking about. But much more importantly, though, I think what is possible and maybe dangerous is that books like the one that you wrote become an avenue for seeking absolution. Or, if you will, people saying, hey, I'm here to be very sad at you, David. And would you guide me through this process? And one of the 52, I think probably one of the most important ones here is not asking Indigenous people to do the work. You have done the work here, and you're saying, okay, now from this point on, don't ask Indigenous people to do the work. How do you navigate that public space where you do have a lot of people saying, hey, I need you to guide me through my feelings, and you're like, perhaps that's best for a therapist?
I don't know. I mean, you're right. I think that, so we all have roles. And we have to understand our roles. We have to accept our roles in our capability of what we have the capability to do. And so in knowing what our roles are, first of all, as Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, we have different roles. And I think that's an important distinction. For Indigenous people, I think we have a couple of roles. One of them is that we have to have space and time to heal ourselves. And I was in a school called Jack River in Norway Cree Nation when, around the time where Tina Fontaine and Colden Bushy, when those trials were coming to an end. And a principal at Jack River School, since passed on, told me brokenness cannot heal brokenness. So we cannot heal this relationship if we are still broken as Indigenous people. And a lot of us are, and a lot of our communities are. And so we need time and space to do the work to heal individually and within our families and our communities. And that's a role that we need to have in order to be effective in the bigger role, And so that's, I think, probably one of the most important things that we can do. And finding that health within ourselves is important and within our families. But the other role that we have is to tell our truths. And so, it's not reconciliation, it's truth and reconciliation. The truth is the stories. And so we tell our stories, and we tell our truths. That is, I think, a responsibility that we have, and I think it's something that we need to have because our stories have been told by others for so long. We now have this movement in Canada over the last 10, 15 years where we now are being able to tell our stories. You know, we have publishers out there who are actively trying to make sure that our stories are out there in the world. Steph here at McClellan Stewart is doing that work. That's her role. That's a platform that she has. You know, for me as a writer, I've accepted the responsibility of having the platform that I have. As much as I don't think that I'm one of the more visible Indigenous writers in this country, I know objectively that I have a platform, and I have to accept that. And then the question is, what do you do with that platform? And my dad would be very disappointed with me if I didn't use it to help people. And so that's a responsibility that I've taken on. And so that requires me to do this. Now, if I keep doing it, I'm not doing anybody any favors because I can't do this all the time for everybody. But I can start people off. And I think that's what this book does. Now, there comes a time when you've learned enough and when you know enough, when you've been given enough ideas, where you can do a lot of this yourself. And that's when we start walking together. And I think that's important.
I think one of the sensitive things that you navigate here is also the difference between cultural appreciation, cultural appropriation. I was trying to sort of imagine people reading that particular chapter, and I have to imagine like some people are like, well, hang on, I'm getting a little sensitive, if you will. There's something about trying to educate people about something that they might get a little sensitive or defensive about. How do you guard yourself against that? You gotta go like, no, I gotta tell you, like, to sort of like navigate this with a bit more sensitivity, because one of the things that you do is you say, you know what, posting on social media, it's not gonna do it. That's not enough. And in fact, if you just post a picture of someone dancing in a regalia, that's, you know, you've said, hello, I'm at an Indigenous event, please like my photo, but you've not really done anything further than that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that distinction between appropriation and appreciation?
Yeah. So, I mean, appropriation is really when we borrow elements or steal elements from another culture, and we use them for our own gain without consent. And so, and our gain can be monetary, or it can be for attention, like likes on social media. And so that is not productive. That sets us back. That's a step backwards. What appreciation is it actually is also asking us to do the work. And so it is, first of all, like learning. So if we're at a powwow, for example, we understand what the regalia is. We understand what it's used for. We understand the jingle dress dance. We understand what that's for. You know, we understand the purpose of it. So that requires us to do some learning. It also requires us to seek consent. And to, if you're going to take a picture with someone, to ask them if it's okay, you know, and to ask them if it's okay if we post it for people to see. And if it's not okay, then we shouldn't do it, you know. And so, that's when we do that learning and that seeking of consent and that understanding that comes from that. It moves from an act of appropriation into an act of appreciation, where we do understand, we have learned, and we have worked in concert with Indigenous people and communities to do things in the right way. And so, and it also is like, you know, if you have a dream catcher in your window at home, or if you have a sweetgrass braid hanging from your rearview mirror, where did you get it from? Who made it? A lot of people, and I'm not saying anybody here, but they might have got it in a gift shop store on a highway somewhere on a road trip. That is not good enough. We also want to make sure that we are procuring stuff from Indigenous artists, and so it's Indigenous made, you know. And so we actually make things for you to use. Like, you know, that's why it's okay to wear moccasins if it's made by an Indigenous creator. I didn't make this book just for Indigenous people. I actually made it for non-Indigenous people. So I made it for that use, you know. So I want you to get this book. I want you to use it. That's the difference.
That idea of writing this book specifically with non-Indigenous audiences in mind, how does that change the writing process? Because you are specifically speaking to people who may be encountering some of these ideas maybe for the first time.
It doesn't. Doesn't change. I mean, I think, in general, first of all, sometimes the loudest voices are coming from the smallest people. That's the first thing. I think generally, and I've met enough people to know this, and again, one of the great privileges of my life in my writing career is knowing a lot of people and meeting a lot of people. I get emails every day from somebody.
You bragging?
No, not at all. I would never do that. But I get a lot of emails, and I got a lot of messages on social media, and I get to talk to a lot of people. And what I've seen is that the vast majority of Canadians are good people. And the vast majority of Canadians want to do the work. And they want to do it in the right way. And that is why I, first of all, never talk down to anybody. I never assume anything. And I would talk to anybody here the same way I would write in the book, and the same way I would talk to anybody. And I think that's important. I think one of the things that I will say about my writing is that it's accessible, and it's open, and it's honest. And I think people appreciate that. And that's because I don't do those things. I don't try to talk down to anybody. I don't try to assume anything. I just want to have a conversation. And I think that this book and All Little Monsters and Blackwater are really conversational. I don't think they're literary. I think they're like, let's sit down and let's talk. And that's what my dad would like too. I think it's let's sit down and let's have a conversation.
There's a generosity in that. I think there's a generosity in saying, you know what, this is exactly how I would talk to you if we met at an event, if we met at a school. I do think that sometimes, for some people, there is, maybe cost is not a word, but there's a burden to that, right? There's a burden to that because you have made yourself a home for those conversations, and you're willing to sort of take them on. Has that been in any kind of way a burden whatsoever?
That's my problem. I don't want anybody to worry about that. And I have people in my life that look out for me, and they see things maybe that I don't see in the work that I'm doing. And it takes something out of me, for sure. But that's a choice that I've made, and I think that, again, it comes down to platform and opportunity. And so I have a platform and opportunity to do this. And if you have a platform and the opportunity to do it, then you ought to do it. And so I don't want anybody to worry about something like that. I'm okay. I have people who look out for me. And so that I don't want anybody, I don't want really anybody really to worry about that, or really just to talk about it, because this is my job and I've chosen to do it. And that's kind of the end of it for me. Yeah.
When one of the things that you weave in here where you really show up is you invite people to read Indigenous comics. And that for you is a deeply personal story. That's how you began doing this thing. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was younger, this is as a young boy, and young boys are usually more reluctant to read than another.
They don't all write 4 books a year, David? At 9 years old?
Well, writing and reading are two different things. Not really, but so when I was a kid, I read a ton of comics. And at that time, when I was growing up in the 80s, comics were great. Comics are a great way to develop reading skills and to bridge the gap between your room and the outside world. But as well, the representation of Indigenous people was pretty awful, and so and very stereotypical. You can boil down how Indigenous people were depicted in comics to very, very common tropes, and they're all really damaging, and they created perceptions of us that were inaccurate. There weren't many accuracies in how Indigenous people were depicted. Everybody, I'm sure, can picture it. There's the war bonnet. There's the leather chaps. There's the mucklucks, or the whatever there might be. There's the spear and the shield, and we're all shirtless. And that's the only thing that's accurate, is the rippling abs that we always have. That's the only thing that's really accurate. But
it's actually why people are here tonight.
Yeah, I know. It's anyway. So I got a tight shirt on the way over here, but no.
But go on.
But in learning as I grew older and breaking down the perception, rebuilding it, the self-perception in a healthy way through story, mostly through my father and what he taught me as I grew up, I realized that everything I'd read was false and it was harmful to me. And so I've also always been a believer in fighting fire with fire. And so I decided that when I started out, I wanted to start doing comics because comics had been so bad in their depiction of Indigenous people. I wanted to write comics that had accurate representation of Indigenous people. And so the first several books I had published were comic books. And they had really good representation, and they were accurate, and they were truthful. And I think that has made a difference in some way. And now you've seen, and not because of me, but you've seen now the representation of Indigenous people in comics has become astronomically better than it was 30, 40 years ago. And that's a part of the movement, you know, and I was just I was a little part of that movement, but it's really positive to see that happen. It's also positive to be able to look at what we have now and look back at what we had then and see the difference between the two and see where we come, but also hopefully motivates us to see where we can go.
But I think that chapter does, and in you sort of not just talking about your dad, but also talking about your own story and how you came to comics, is give permission, I think, to the reader to do the thing that this book does best, which is to say it takes a larger concept. It takes the concept of reconciliation and say, stop thinking about the larger word, and start thinking about where you can see it in your life, where you can see it, where it can sort of show up in very simple ways and hard ways in your life. And that is, you pre-anticipated earlier, but this is where I was going, which is to say the idea of the invitation of saying, create your own. And by creating your own, the invitation there is to say, now that you've seen the way that the world could look different, where else is it going to show up in your life? I know the book is barely out, but what have you heard from people about that specific invitation, the idea that, you know what, now you have a bit of literacy. Where in your life do you see one place where reconciliation could take shape?
Well, I mean, to me, the answer is always in the youth. That's the answer. So if you have kids, if you are a teacher, if you have any sort of, if you have nieces and nephews, we, unfortunately, unfairly, have placed the burden of change on youth. They are the leaders. They can be leaders today, and they are, but they will be leaders tomorrow. And so a lot of my work, and that's why most of my books, out of the, how many books there are.
It's 36, David. I'm counting.
But that's why all of them, except for 3 of them, well, 2, this one I would like to see in middle years in high school as well, but that's why most of them are for kids, because kids are the answer. Kids are the key. And so the more we arm ourselves with the ability to educate children and have a positive influence in their direction, then prepare them to do the work in a good way so they can do better than we have done in the past, I think that's the most valuable thing that we can do in this country, is make sure that we're preparing the youth to be the people that we need them to be to make our future a lot better than it is now in the present.